the controversies, or maybe I should say controversies, yes, that had emerged during this conference. But actually, I think there's been relatively little controversy. Oversimplifying, at least it seems to me, that everyone has sort of agreed that neuroscience holds great promise for implications for the legal system, but that it's not there yet, and that there's a danger in trying to apply neuroscience too quickly to the legal system before the science itself has developed to a point that will support serious use. So the panel decided we would change topics a little bit and talk about some of the implications, both for the legal system and otherwise, that have kind of emerged from the discussion over the last couple of days. So this will be a sort of miscellaneous potpourri, if you will, of topics, but we think have in common that they are sort of suggested by what's emerged the last couple of days. So we'll begin with Judge Morris Hoff.
Thank you, Jed, and I want to thank the National Academy and the Royal Society. It's really just a privilege to be a part of this movement. It's been a fascinating day and a half. I want to make two really quick comments. One of them I want to focus on. Do I need a mic?
Yeah, there's no microphone, so you can like a mic.
Stay here.
Want to just stay here? I'm happy to stay here. Okay, great. I'll stay here. So the first comment I want to make is to switch from the brains of criminals to the brains of those of us who judge the behaviors of criminals. And I think the two sets of brains are important. And I also want to put in a pitch for evolution. There's been very little mention of the E word here today. It's been sprinkled around. It seems to me that brains and therefore behaviors, or at least behavioral predispositions, are the products of natural selection. And so too, I think, are great chunks of the law. And I think one way to look at this intersection of law and neuroscience, and in fact one of the ways some earlier speakers have put the question, is that the law is old and plodding, and neuroscience is new and exciting, and never the twain shall meet, and this is part of the problem. But in fact, our brains have been judging each other for 200,000 years. We're very good at blaming. We're very good at punishing, but we're not perfect. And so what interests me in this first area that I want to talk about is those areas where we're not so perfect. I think Paul Robinson's and John Darley's work has been mentioned. They show that with remarkable uniformity that people are very good and very precise at assessing at least relative blameworthiness for different kinds of crimes. But we're not perfect. And so I've been thinking a lot in the last several years about the ways in which we're not perfect, and to focus on those, what I call legal dissonances, those areas where there's a difference between our evolved natures as blaming and punishing social animals and what the law expects of us when we blame and punish. So, for example, I think you can think of maybe 4 different categories of dissonances. There are blaming dissonances. Despite how good we are, as the Robinson studies showed, the law has some doctrines, both English and American law has some doctrines that distort those blaming instincts. Felony murder is a doctrine that distorts those instincts. 3 strikes. There are some doctrines that force us to punish in a fashion that's much greater than any of us is naturally comfortable in doing. Well, what do we do about that is another question. That's maybe a different panel. There are harm dissonances. So the law, and there's an evolutionary explanation for this, the law has always had the harm principle, which is that the law basically, at least the criminal law, basically doesn't care about bad behavior if there's not been harm. There are some exceptions to the harm principle. Attempt, conspiracy, moral luck is really a problem with the harm principle. So we have two defendants with identical states of mind who do exactly the same thing, drive drunk, for example. One kills somebody and one just runs into a tree. We have trouble with dealing with those two situations in the law, and I think part of the trouble reflects this dissonance. I've become, in the last couple years, very interested in a different kind of dissonance, which I guess I'll call a probabilistic dissonance. We are, one of the things we're bad at as evolved social animals is some kinds of risk assessment. So, we're hyperbolic discounters. We don't do well in assessing future risks and future benefits, and we are terrible Bayesian reasoners. So we think more about for example, in an eyewitness testimony situation, we think more about how certain the witness is, and even if the witness was certain, that certainty is distorting, because the question is, what's the base rate and how many false positives are we getting, and all sorts of those things. It turns out that physicians, by the way, are also terrible Bayesian reasoners, and we have a fellow in the MacArthur Foundation, Peter Embry, whose full-time job is to teach doctors how to become better Bayesian reasoners and to think about base rates before jumping to conclusions about how the use of this drug will double the risk. It matters what base that risk is being applied to. So, and the law is full of these probabilistic dissonances. Every time causation is an issue in a case, which is every case, there's often an issue about Bayesian reasoning. In the criminal area, eyewitness testimony is full of these issues. Photo lineups are full of these issues. A photo lineup is a sort of distortion of the base rate. We show a witness 6 photos with one suspect in it, and what we're really doing is telling the witness these other 5 suspects represent the entire universe of the base. And so when the witness says, I'm 99% sure it's that person, we have to think about the false positives applied to that huge base that's not part of the lineup. And then finally, on this topic of dissonances, I've become interested in what I call process dissonances. So one of the biggest challenges of trial judges when we're presiding over a jury trial is to try to get the jury not to decide something too soon. And the way trials are built is we hear from one side first, and we don't hear anything from the other side, and oftentimes in criminal cases, never anything from the other side. And it's a real challenge to get jurors to not jump to conclusions. And I'm interested in what both behavioral and neuroscience can teach us to help us to have our jurors become the kind of dispassionate, patient decision makers that at least we pretend they are. The last thing I want to talk about is an experiment that we just finished that was funded by the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience Project that examined one kind of these blaming dissonances, the law of culpability. For those of you who are not lawyers, let me just say very quickly that the law has struggled for approximately, 200,000 years over the question of what is culpability, and can we slice it more finely than just accidents and intentional acts. And this has been a terribly complex and highly charged debate in the law. And 50 years ago, in fact, this is the 50th anniversary of the model penal code in which the American Law Institute, at least, said, here's how we're going to do this. And they set forth 4 states of mind: purposeful, knowing, reckless, and negligent, and defined those, and tried to put some coherence into a very incoherent area of jurisprudence. And it's worked out pretty well. But they did that without any kind of behavioral studies. There have been no significant behavioral studies, and we thought, well, do people really think of intentionality in these categories that the model penal code thinks they do? And so we ran a study. It's on. We just put it on SSRN. I'm happy to email you with the link. Any of you who want it, I have to. I don't want to run through the study. We're formally presenting it tomorrow, actually, back in Denver. The bottom line is we are, and I was surprised by this, because in my experience, I think jurors have trouble with purposeful and knowing, or what the philosophers call the side effect problem. But in fact, our subjects were really great at distinguishing all of the categories, with one terrible exception, and the terrible exception was between knowing and reckless. They could not distinguish the categories. They couldn't sort them. They didn't punish them any differently. And that was true whether we gave them the instructions or not. And this has enormous. If these results hold, it has some real. It should have some enormous reforming impact, because in the area of homicide, in most states, there's a tremendous difference between a knowing homicide, which is often called second-degree murder in many jurisdictions, and reckless homicide, which is often called manslaughter. The difference can be the difference between probation and 5 decades in the penitentiary. I mean, it's that sharp. And if our jurors are just guessing about whether a homicide was knowing or reckless, that's a tremendous problem. So I'm done.